to Photo Live. Thank you so much for joining us in person here at M Pavilion Parkade. It's wonderful having people back together, albeit socially distanced. Or if you're joining us online at home, welcome too. My name is Elias Redstone. I'm the Artistic Director of Photo 2021 International Festival of Photography. And I'm delighted to be welcoming you here to this talk this evening. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and the Boon Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Indigenous people joining us here today or online. Welcome back to Photo Live, our series of artist conversations about the social and cultural role photography plays in our lives, featuring a number of Photo 2021 artists who have been not just making new work, but making new work for the public realm. I'd like to briefly thank Creative Victoria for supporting these events and keeping them free and accessible to everyone, and also to M Pavilion for being wonderful hosts for us here. The event this evening is going to be expertly hosted by Mary Parker, who manages the Metro Tunnel Creative Program. Anyone that is not in Melbourne may not know that as well as dealing with a pandemic, this whole city is pretty much under construction at the moment. And Mary has the rather amazing role of working with these sites in flux to activate them, working with artists and creatives to use this moment of transition for the city as a huge opportunity to commission work and to activate construction sites in unique and unexpected ways. Mary will be telling you more about that. She'll be introducing our artists, Disher-Quill and Phoebe Powell, and their incredible work that they've been presenting for Photo 2021. So let's begin, please, by just giving a big round of applause to all our panelists, and I'll hand over to Mary. Thank you.
Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Parker, and tonight, in fact, you're all Parkers, sitting in your own little car parks here in the M Pavilion, which feels quite appropriate. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. The project we're going to talk about tonight has been 10 months in the making, I believe it was, and started with a phone call from me working at home and sitting on the couch, actually, and thinking, I think it's time that we did something to acknowledge these amazing people working in the Parkville precinct around the outside of one of our new stations and walking around our construction sites to work, but also, you know, managing to work during this pandemic. And I thought it would be really good to get some photos of them. Who should take them? And in the space of about 5 minutes, I rang Phoebe. And that is because we knew we needed somebody that we could put into a situation where there had to be a great deal of empathy and sensitivity and intuition. And that is why Phoebe Powell was my photographer of choice for this particular job. So Phoebe, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and how you actually became to be a photographer? And answer my phone call while I was sitting on the couch?
I feel like that's more of an interesting story. I mean, I studied RMIT, but I guess when I got that phone call, I was actually having that panic of being a freelance photographer and going, what am I going to do? You know, we're in a pandemic and all my jobs were cancelled, and Mary called and I couldn't have been happier. But also because as a photographer that, you know, is a storyteller, I was kind of wondering, how am I going to contribute to the pandemic and kind of, you know, documenting it. And I was seeing lots of portraits that people were doing through bedroom windows, and I was like, what's my part in that? And then Mary just handed it to me, and it was just such an opportunity. And so with that project, we ended up photographing 52 healthcare workers.
Healthcare workers, but also I think it's important to say medical researchers and a lot of people, you know, people who were cleaners and who were receptionists, because of course we think about frontline healthcare, but there is in fact an army behind the scenes working on this. And this was the photo essay, a snippet of it, because quite often with the construction sites, they're very large and we can't even photograph the whole artworks for you. So there's a snippet behind the screen behind me. But I'll just go to the next one, because that's where we meet the delightful Kate. So Phoebe, do you want to tell us about this photo and who took it?
Yeah, this is a glorious image that Kate took behind the scenes of the portrait sessions. Kate is a good friend of mine, and we've been friends for years, and she's an incredible artist and photographer. And so I thought I needed an assistant, and I missed my friend because we'd just come out of a lockdown. So I thought, let's get Kate on board. But also Kate has a beautiful way of kind of disarming people into conversation. And it's, I couldn't think of anyone that would be better to accompany me in these portraits. And yeah.
So Kate, do you want to tell us about how you got involved in photography and visual narrative?
How did I get into photography? I never studied photography. I actually studied design, but I guess I was always a better photographer than a designer. But I guess how we came to be here, I don't know, do you want me to say what we decided from that shoot? Or
I think this photo is quite telling, because in colour this photo actually looks like an amazing sort of Renaissance painting with the blues, and you're in this extraordinary room. And I just sort of sense that this photo is the beginning of the two of you going, there's a bit more in this than just these portraits. So do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah. So I guess when Phoebe first told me that she was doing a series of portraits, I was, obviously it was an amazing opportunity for us to kind of get insight into what was going on in the pandemic. It was May, and, we were stuck at home. Again, as a photographer, losing most of my work for the year, I was just like, what's going on? And so this was just a great opportunity to talk to people and be like, what is a day in your life like right now? And we realised that there was just such an opportunity to share their stories. And I guess, a lot of my work is storytelling based, but also in the health sector. And it just seemed like a no-brainer to listen to them and see where this would go. And so that was, I guess, the beginning of Surge.
So that's a nice segue. And so this is Surge being installed, and you'll see here one of the subjects that was in the portrait shoot, but you also get a sense of the scale of the work. And this is down on Swanston Street outside what was the city square, what will be the new town hall station when our project is finally finished delivering its tunnels and stations. And one of the challenges, interestingly, from a photography perspective, is it's really almost too big to capture in one shot. So we've got James Henry, his lovely work here to try and get it, but that's 40 metres. And really it's best experienced if you walk past it. And I think you thought about this when you were putting it together, didn't you? Because there is actually a sort of a beginning of the piece as people are walking past, and a bit of a narrative as you walk along. So Phoebe, do you want to talk us through the design?
Absolutely. I guess, to simplify it, we were telling many different stories, and they were all standalone. We would interview one of our subjects and we would think about how to create images in lockdown to reflect their experience. But maybe we'll talk a bit more about that when we're talking about the process. But we had hundreds of images, and we engaged designer and curator Heidi Romano, who, when we were able to, came to my studio, and Kate and I spread out prints, and we realised that there was a strong narrative from kind of the start of the pandemic based on Julian Druce, who's in our work and also here tonight, who has been working on coronavirus for most of his career and diagnosis. So we thought, well, let's start this narrative with a strong portrait of Julian and the virus, and kind of take the viewer on a journey, not to the end of the pandemic, because we're still very much in it, but to the end of when we felt finished with our stories, and also when there was a sense of relief felt amongst the healthcare workers, and also when we're coming out of lockdown. So it does work quite well from left to right, but each image still has its own kind of strength in story.
So I encourage you all to go down and have a look at it. But what we're able to do this evening is actually take a few of these images and some that didn't necessarily make it onto the hoarding, because the whole process of putting this together was one that was done with extreme challenges, but probably in some ways, dare I say, it led to an even more innovative and creative outcome because of that. So I'm going to be quite short and sharp from now on, because I'm basically going to show you some of the images, and Kate and Phoebe are going to tell you what is behind them. So without further ado, tell us about this. Kate, do you want to talk us through what's going on here?
Okay. So, yeah, the project came to us in May, and then was at end of June, July, we ended up completely in lockdown. And I remember we had a meeting with Elias and the 2021 crew, I think in June. And it's sort of a bizarre thing thinking back to, we had to conceptualize a project for February this year, back in June, when we had no idea what the hell was going to happen with the pandemic. And we kind of joked about how, oh, well, maybe it won't even be a big deal, and by February, no one will ever remember it. However, obviously, the reverse happened, and it ended up way more hectic than we even imagined. And we basically were stuck in lockdown from the beginning of July, and Phoebe and I are on opposite sides of the city. We physically didn't see each other for months, but we had to work on this project and figure out how we're going to do it. So a lot of it was Zoom and phone calls, pretty much, a lot of the time, partly because we really didn't have much else to do.
But on Zoom, you don't have to wear masks.
No.
And here you are. So why is that?
So because we physically weren't allowed to go and meet any of the healthcare workers that were in the project, we started off having Zoom conversations, and then once we realised we had to create some imagery, so we asked them to send us some PPE. We're like, well, we'll start making some photos at home. And a lot of them were describing the experience of the N95 mask, and, we've all seen it, the masks on the face and the impact that it causes. And so we were like, we have to give it a go. And this was the two of us on Zoom. We decided to do an hour with the N95 mask on, and to then see what it would feel like and what it would look like after. And yeah, I guess we were both pretty confronted by how difficult it was. Yeah.
So that also leads quite nicely into the fact that you realised you had to sort of almost recreate some of these stories that you were hearing visually, but not go to site and do it. So this next one, this is Kate's, this is your collage, is it?
Pardon?
Are these your works?
They're both of ours.
Ah, okay.
There's some...
But these are reenactments.
So that's, yeah. So out of the, I can't actually remember how many are in the project, but basically half of the images are not of the healthcare workers. They're actually of either Phoebe, myself, or our partners, because we were stuck at home having to create these images. So that's actually Phoebe pretending to be a swab test.
I got a few looks from our neighbours. It was a funny day. This was outside of lockdown, however, when we could finally see each other and make work together. However, we weren't able to... first of all, DHHS were like, you cannot take photos because we are too busy. But secondly, we were restricted with being able to go and take photos of people in their places of work. So we got creative at home with the PPE, and some of these works, like the second image is a self-portrait Kate took during lockdown. But yeah, they're all recreations of...
This is interesting, because when you look at the theme of Photo 21, which at 2021 it's truth, and I think there's always an interesting argument about whether you can be more true with something created than perhaps a factually based narrative. So, for example, you can read a novel that's about World War II and it can give you the facts and figures, or you can read a fictional account of it that perhaps has got more emotion behind it. So Tell us how you're playing a bit with the idea of truth, but also perhaps bringing more of a real feeling than you might have captured considering the circumstances you were in.
Yeah, it was quite interesting when we got told the theme was truth, because we had both been reflecting on what was going on in the media at the time compared to what we were being told by some of the workers. And so it sort of was like a serendipitous theme. We're like, oh, this is exactly the right theme. But then again, this questioning of putting ourselves into the work, I guess posing as healthcare workers, it then makes you just question, I guess, what is real, what's not real. But yeah, we really had to reflect on how we were going to tell their stories, the truth of their stories, the real experiences, while physically being unable to be there.
And I also think that being able to spend so much time actually talking to our participants, as opposed to with the thank you series, I hadn't met any of them and I took their picture after meeting them that minute. So developing a bit of a connection with our subjects, I think enabled us to show a more honest interpretation of them. So I think that there is a sense of truth in those portraits, but also in the detailed images. It's a little bit more accurate than if we were to just walk into their place of work and just document what we saw. There's a lot more meaning to the images.
So is there any here that you want to give us a little insight into, particularly the shower? Do we want to share what's going on there? Or is that just...
That was one of the first images that Kate actually made. It was a long time before we started taking photos. But one of our amazing subjects, Nicola, was talking about how she doesn't feel like she still has a sense of anxiety until she gets in the shower at home at night. So working in the emergency department during a pandemic and that anxiety of taking it home, contaminating her family. So, Kate.
Yeah, and I suppose this idea of having to cleanse, like, to me, it just had to be captured. And maybe there's a little, I mean, it's my partner, and I'll probably embarrass him by... it's a bit of a running joke that, you know, he's got his image up on Swanston Street. Well, and I was just like, hey, I'm just going to take a photo of you. But I guess there's probably a bit of my personal experience in it that during lockdown, like the shower was kind of the best part of the day. And it just, and when Nicola talked about it, it's that like the catharsis, it's the cleansing, and it just needed to be in there. But yeah, it was quite early on in the beginning. I was like, I've just got to get that shower shot.
Got to start somewhere.
Now, there's a series of beautiful sort of compositions that you put together, and we're going to run through a few now. So, Phoebe, do you want to talk us through this one and the process of it and how these two images came together?
I might let Kate talk about it because it's actually a self-portrait.
So I guess the recreating the subject's images was, we realised it had to be part of it because, again, we didn't know when we were going to have access, and we knew we had to capture what they were going through in lockdown. You know, we didn't want to have to wait until we were out of lockdown to capture all the photographs, and we just asked them to send us images, you know, because it was the only physical, I guess, the real representation of what they were going through. So we kind of prompted them with questions and ideas about what they could send us, that we really wanted to get an insight into what they were going through. So it was sort of this participatory idea. And a lot of them sent images of the marks of the face because it was clearly a huge impact that well, I mean, we've all had to go through it, but obviously the healthcare workers having to wear the N95 masks and to be, you know, so at risk of getting COVID. And yeah, we knew we had to show the marks. So that photo was actually taken after our Zoom conversation. So we'll just, you know, see what it would look like. And yeah, that was the self-portrait after.
All right, Phoebe, this one's for you then.
Okay, well, I'll explain the image in a second, but with the style of imagery that we kind of recreated, I think my background's largely commercial and studio and product, and so Kate and I kind of collaborating, we're like, what can we bring that's unique to our methods? So I thought we'd like to do some of the imagery in the studio as a product photography. And so we received one of these tiny little pictures from Nicola, and it was in response to, I guess, what's boosting morale at work at the moment. And she sent this great shot of her, you know, with her PPE champion sticker and a bunch of flowers in a urine bottle. And and I just thought that was just so nice to see a bit of light. And we do want there to be light in this story. You know, it's obviously a very emotive kind of piece and you know, story in itself. So to bring a bit of humour in there was fun.
How did you get the urine bottle? Did you just Google?
Well, no, actually, I took Nicola's portrait when we were out of lockdown in the car park. That's actually in the series, and
So there was a handing over in a car park.
She handed me she gave me a couple. I don't know where they ended up actually, but yeah, so it's actually straight from her. And I think what's nice about this work is that when you look at it, you don't, if you didn't know what a urine bottle would look like, it might not mean much to you. It's just flowers. But for healthcare workers, and that's largely our target audience as well, is that it's got that sense of kind of, I know what that is, and that's funny. You know, I can relate to that.
How did you choose the flowers that went in it?
I think what I could get from the local shop that was open, because at the time supermarkets were the only things that were open. So, yeah.
Needs must. Now this one, obviously the humble donut didn't have such enormous connotations behind it before sort of the beginning of 2020. What was the story behind this shot? Which of you wants to? Kate?
Yeah, so Pat, who was he's an anaesthetist, it's such a struggle, in the women's hospital. He sent us a bunch of photos, and one of the things that we asked them to kind of reflect on was what's bringing you joy, what's getting you through the day. And he sent us a photo of the Krispy Kremes, and this was well before the donut day became a thing. But as you would all know, that Donut Day did become a thing, and we just thought, you know, we've got to mark, you know, this, again, it's sort of this historical archive of what happened in 2020. And serendipitously, this happened to, when we photographed it, it was actually the 12th day of no cases. And, you know, we'd already booked in the shoot, and we're just like, would you believe it?
I have to say this photo, these photos reminded me a few years ago, I toured a whole lot of photographs that were taken for the Country Roads Board for the Vic Road Centenary, and they had a photographer on the staff dating back to 1913, and there was 100,000 images in the archive. And one of them that took my fancy was where the Country Roads Board was outside the exhibition buildings, and it was this beautiful old car, and it was having this black steel cap fitted over the light. And it was during the 40s and the war, and they were blackout caps that were being put on. And at the time, that would have been a very common feature, and everybody would have known about it. And to us, it looks like this memento of the past. And the donuts, to me, were sort of those things, those small things that become symbolic of what it actually is everyday life when you're going through a period of crisis. So.
Yeah, and being able to archive it in a different way instead of just documenting, I think, is important, because we felt really frustrated at the start of the project because we couldn't go and just take photos of what was happening because we were in lockdown. So creating an archive just feels very, very satisfying.
This is a really lovely one, and I remember where this sort of came from. This is with the lovely Grace, who we'll come to in a minute. And I remember early on when Phoebe was texting me from the photo shoot, the thank you one, and telling me, you know, some of the stories that she was hearing. This was one that came up. So, Phoebe, do you want to talk us through this particular shot?
So we received the phone photo from Grace, when I'd met her in the Thank You series, some of the people we photographed for Surge were in the Thank You series, but we also expanded to other hospitals to try and get a really good spread of representation across Melbourne. But Grace had, when we took her portrait, just shaved her head. She works in the infectious disease ward, and she was just tired of coming home and washing her hair and having the anxiety of bringing it home in her hair. And so, and you know, she was also really, like, when we did our Zoom conversation with her, she missed her hair, you know, so it was this incredible symbol. These phone photos, they may be tiny and blurry and you know, taken without much thought, but they were so insightful. And so we recreated it in the studio because we literally couldn't scale a phone photo for a hoarding. It just wouldn't have gone that large. But yeah.
So whose hair is that?
His name's Jack. My friend's a hairdresser and hooked me up with a bag of hair.
Amazing.
I should have credited him in the story.
So I think that's sort of a nice example of some of the process of how you managed to make this work. But the next few slides we've got are actually, you know, some of the subjects that you met through this. So I'm hoping you can share a few of their stories because they're all pretty amazing. So this one for you, Kate?
Well, I think I should turn this back to Phoebe because this is Grace.
This is Grace.
This is
Grace.
Grace is, as I mentioned, a nurse in the infectious disease ward, and in conversation, she talked about her bond with her sister and how her sister lived down the road and she couldn't see her and she missed her when we were having the conversation during lockdown when she was in her bedroom and we were in, you know, at our individual homes. And Grace actually caught COVID at work. And so, you know, her experience and insight was just so incredible because doing her job and, you know, the expectation of her as a healthcare worker to do her job resulted in her actually catching COVID. And thankfully she made a full recovery and, you know, lived to tell the tale. And I wanted to kind of show that experience of being in isolation, being in quarantine and feeling disconnected from her sister. So when we were out of lockdown and when she had fully recovered, we recreated that experience of her connecting with her sister through her bedroom window.
It was actually she described having to say goodbye to her sister before she got taken away to the quarantine hotel that all the healthcare workers got put into. But it was quite a profound moment that she just said, you know, looking through the window, I just didn't know if I'd see my sister again. And so that's basically what Phoebe recreated.
Do you want to talk us through this one, Kate?
Yeah, so this is Tamishta. She is a registrar in intensive care and was in the palliative care ward, palliative COVID ward. So a lot of, I guess that's pretty much one of the hardest places to be during lockdown. There were no visitors allowed. The doctors, the nurses basically had to be the support as, you know, holding iPads up to the patients that would never be able to see, I guess, their family that were dying. And then also having to be on the phone to all the family members that just wanted to be there and couldn't. And it was probably one of the hardest conversations that we had with everyone because, you know, she's a registrar, still quite young and was totally burnt out and did 4 weeks in the ward and, you know, they asked her to stay on and she was just like, no, I was only asked for 4 weeks. So we were glad she did that. But one of the things we did ask her was how do you end your shift? Like what happens when you leave the hospital? And she basically said that she would get into a car and just talk to her family the whole way home. And I guess I just knew I had to capture that moment. And so when, you know, it was months later that we actually got to meet in person, but I said I want to recreate that moment in the car. And it felt kind of strange because also during lockdown, you know, it would get dark at 6. So obviously she went home in the dark, but by the time I took this, it was summer. and it was still light at 6. So it's sort of reflecting on the fact that we had to do the shoot later than she would normally finish her shift, but basically putting her back into that moment, and that's what it...
I think this shot is interesting because it's so atmospheric and almost cinematic. It could be a shot from a still of a film. And I think there's something interesting. I think Phoebe and I have talked a bit about the whole process of doing this, that so often in the media we hear our frontline staff are heroes, and there is this idea of saviours and strength and stamina, and I wonder whether that means that, you know, is it okay to show the public the vulnerabilities, you know, that people are going through? And there is a sort of enormous vulnerability in this photo as well. But how did you sort of deal with the fact of keeping, you know, the real identity of the people that you were photographing and their real experiences, and capturing that in a non-cliched way? No pressure.
It's a tricky question. I guess the expectation of healthcare workers, or even just the labelling of healthcare workers as heroes, does kind of make them superhuman, in a sense that it doesn't reflect on the fact that it's hard and they are vulnerable, and it is, you know, almost unfair to expect a single person to work weeks on end with no break in the hours that they were expected to work, and in complete, you know, isolation, and having their lunch in empty offices because they can't go to the lunchroom. So we wanted to, part of the purpose of this work is to show that although the work that they are doing is heroic, they aren't heroes, they're humans.
And I think it's this interesting thing, isn't it, that you can be strong and vulnerable. You can be amazing and still, you know, really experience things, which is perhaps going back to the theme of the Photo 21 festival of truth. So is that sort of something you consciously were aiming for?
I think we realised once we started setting up these Zoom conversations that really, regardless what it would end up in by the end of it, whatever images we'd have, that we gave these people an outlet to just talk. And like the amount of response that was just, oh, wow, thanks for asking me, or thanks for listening to me. You know, just giving them a space to share their story, that, you know, it wasn't with a journalist that was going to somehow skew what they were saying, that, you know, we just basically sat there and said, tell us whatever you want. And so we were able to, I guess, listen to their truth and, share it. And I think,
All right, who's going to talk to this one and tell us about Nicola?
This is Nicole Walsham, and a portrait taken as soon as I could actually go and take. I think Nicola was my first portrait outside of lockdown, and I was so excited to be able to actually be there with her. In her Zoom meeting, she talked about the apprehension of driving into the car park before work and before she puts on her mask, and that kind of getting ready for battle kind of a sense that she had. But also she talked about the long hours she was doing, finishing at 4 a.m. The car park was often empty because there was no visitors. And she told us a funny story of being pulled, being pulled over by police. COVID funny, being pulled over by police. I think more than once, because she was driving around at night. She was just going home, but people
like 4 a.m.
4 a.m. being pulled over because police think that it's someone up to no good, but it's just her going home.
She was up to a lot of good.
Yeah, exactly, Mary, yeah.
And this is a beautiful image, and I think this sort of ties in with what you were talking about with the relief or release, or through these long conversations you had with people looking for what helped them cope. So, Kate, do you want to tell us about Sebastian in this image?
Yeah, so this photo didn't end up making it into the final series, which was a bit of, I mean, you obviously have to let go of images for the whole thing, but it was one of my favourite, and it was my first photo shoot out of lockdown, and it's Sebastian, and he's does the genomic sequencing testing, but basically working from home the whole time, and that was another kind of moment for both of us, realising, oh yeah, there's these, I guess, healthcare professionals that are stuck at home as well, and they're working endless hours, and the demand, obviously, when there were hundreds of cases every day, was huge. And again, when we asked, what are you doing to get through it? And he talked about ocean swimming and how he had started ocean swimming because the pools were all closed. And just the feeling of being in the water and, being in the ocean, and that's basically his therapy. And for me, it was...
So again, the cleansing in the shower and the importance
Yeah,
of water.
again, there's obviously a common theme with me and water. And I was just so missing the water as well. And when he talked about it, I was like, I have to photograph him in the ocean. And so that was, my first shoot out of lockdown, and to me quite a special moment because it was also the first time I'd been in the water in months. And I suppose I didn't know what, this was actually shot on film, so I didn't know what it was going to look like, but what I was, in the end, what it kind of envisioned was this idea of having to keep our heads above water, so...
I think we've got about 10 minutes, and I thought it'd be nice if there's any questions, but also to leave a bit of time, because Phoebe, I know there's some acknowledgements and thank yous you would like to make, so we'll come back to that too. But if there are any questions, I believe there is a mic roving around. And while we're waiting, I was just going to say, how did the two of you get on? Did you disagree about any of... there's a lot of composition and joining of things there.
Look, I think that when you're collaborating, there's always, especially because Kate and I have quite unique styles, and to try and make a work that was cohesive was tricky, but black and white helped with that. But what was nice is we brought both of our styles together. We have these kind of stylized studio shots along with these really emotive portraits and details. So, but I'm just really grateful to have been able to work with Kate over the lockdown and to collaborate and to be able to check in with her every day just to talk about work and also check in with each other. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for this talk. It's so insightful, and we've obviously been with you on the journey for making it, but hearing all these additional stories is fascinating. The question I have is actually about something brought up near the start, about how you said that the target audience for this was the healthcare workers themselves, which I thought was fascinating as a way of thinking about the project and how you presented it. So I guess there's two sides to the question. One is, how do you feel that shifted the way you actually presented this to the public in such a public, it's on the streets of Melbourne, and also whether you have had a response from that audience and how you feel it's connected with them.
I feel like it's still early days in terms of how people have responded to the work, and I'm really excited to hear those responses. I think it being their stories and us being the kind of medium to get those stories out into the public was really important to us in the beginning. We also do have an agenda, and that's to connect people with healthcare workers as fellow humans. So, instead of, it is a photo documentary in a sense that we don't want to, being honest to their stories was more important to us than exaggerating or, I think.
Yeah, I suppose, yes, it's about the healthcare workers, and I suppose more than anything we wanted to respect their stories, their experiences, but we also did want to make it a series that we could all relate to. So the quotes in it are very much chosen specifically so that we can all relate. The anxiety was felt by, or still is felt by, so many of us. But I think we just, it's hard to know what, I guess, other healthcare workers will think, but the ones that are in the project have very much just loved the fact that they feel like their experience is beyond them in their scrubs or, work uniform, that they do feel like they were heard. And
I have to say, one of the things I quite liked about going through the process with you is that some of these people, to me, were celebrities. You know, oh, you're photographing Jodie McVernon. You know, I listen to her on RN Drive every night because these are these important, influencing voices, and it was really nice to see healthcare workers get a similar sort of treatment to sports stars or television presenters. So I think that was a lovely outcome.
And I might just add, I think, you know, showing things that we're all very familiar with and probably really sick of seeing might seem to some people as a bit tedious, but Kate coined the term recovery earlier on in the process, and I think that it just summed up what we're trying to do. And this is about acknowledging the work of these incredible people, but also we can't just sweep this under the rug and move on. We need to kind of recover and have that sense in the community of acknowledgement of what we've all been through to be able to move forward.
Are there any other questions? Phoebe, do you want to finish off then with your thank yous?
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, we had some help from some coordinators, and like I said, we wanted to feature a good spread of hospitals and institutes across Melbourne. So I'd like to thank the Peter Doherty Institute, the Women's Hospital, Walter and Eliza Hall, the Austin, the Epworth, the Northern, Royal Melbourne Hospital, the Alfred, and St Vinny's. And I'd also like to thank Julian Druce, Julie McCauley, Patrick Tan, Rima Darwich, Sebastian Duchenne, David Story, Claire McLean, Tamishta Hensman, Grace Carroll, Michelle Anada Raja, Nicole Walsh, Nicola Walsham, and Glenn Tarrant, who were the participants in our story. So, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and
Thanks
also
to Photo
I'd like to thank Photo 2021 for the opportunity to showcase our work, and also Metro Tunnel Creative Program for supporting us and commissioning us to do this. Thank you. Thank you, Mary.
Our pleasure.